So imagine it's 1973. You're a college administrator, and you get handed a microscopic budget. I'm talking like $3,000.
Right. Barely anything.
Yeah, and you're told with that $3,000, you have to build 11 entire women's sports teams completely from scratch.
It's just an impossible task.
It really is. But then you fast forward 50 years, and that exact same law, the one that started with those $3,000 budgets, is now triggering these massive multi-million-dollar class action lawsuits over, get this, invisible phantom rowers.
Phantom rowers on Ivy League spreadsheets.
Exactly. Hidden on compliance spreadsheets.
Yeah.
So the big question for you, our listener, is how did we get here? How did a law that was just meant to ensure simple equality turn into, like, a masterclass in accounting fraud?
And that is the defining question of this whole landscape, really. Because I think we tend to view civil rights legislation as a finish line, you know?
For sure. Like, the president signs the paper and boom, problem solved.
Yeah, exactly. You sign a piece of paper and society just instantly transforms. But the reality on the ground is it's so much messier than that.
Oh, completely.
It's really a story of, like, bureaucratic trench warfare.
Mm-hmm.
Progress is fought over line by line, whether that's in federal courts or athletic director offices, or ultimately just on the margins of accounting ledgers.
Which is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
We've got an incredibly rich dossier of source material to pull from for this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We're specifically looking at an investigation titled Leaders and Laggards, which is episode 5 of 37 words.
It's a fantastic source, really detailed.
It is. And our mission today is to kind of tear down that neat, tidy narrative of Title IX compliance in college sports and look at the actual plumbing.
The nuts and bolts of how it actually works.
Right. We need to unpack how this was built on the ground. So we'll start with the administrators who championed the rule, then look at the holdouts who structured their entire institutional finances just to fight this to the Supreme Court.
And, of course, the modern universities that are actively rigging the numbers today.
Exactly. So to understand the sheer scale of the chaos those early administrators faced, I mean, we have to look at the text of the law itself, right?
Yeah, we absolutely do. Title IX is famously just 37 words long. And the most shocking thing about those 37 words, honestly, is that they contain absolutely zero mentions of sports.
Wait, none at all?
None. No mention of athletic rosters, gymnasiums, locker rooms, nothing.
That's wild. So what does it actually say?
It just simply states that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in any education program receiving federal funds. That's it. It was a complete blank slate.
So you have a blank slate, but you also have this immediate mandate from the government. I mean, put yourself in a college administrator's shoes in the mid-'70s, you know?
Right. It's 1972. The law passes.
Yeah, and suddenly you have female students knocking on your door demanding varsity teams. But the statute gives you no metrics whatsoever.
Exactly. You're left holding the bag.
Like, how do you apply a generalized anti-discrimination clause to a football team that generates millions of dollars and then compare that to a women's field hockey team that's just been, like, operating as an unfunded club?
You really can't. And that created this 7-year information vacuum where schools were essentially just flying blind.
7 years of just guessing what the law means.
Basically, yeah, which created a massive legal and logistical bottleneck. I mean, university presidents were desperate for a measuring stick.
They needed someone to tell them what the rules were.
Right. They needed the federal government to define what equal opportunity actually looked like in the context of athletics. Because athletics is inherently segregated by sex, you know.
Right. You can't just apply normal workplace rules to it.
Exactly. You cannot just apply standard employment discrimination tests to a basketball roster. It required a completely customized regulatory framework.
And that framework finally arrived on December 11th, 1979. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which we usually just call AIAW, issued a policy interpretation.
And this document is monumental.
It really is. It laid the literal foundation for modern college sports because it established what we now know as the three-part test.
Yes. The three-part test is the absolute bedrock of athletic compliance to this day.
Still being used right now.
Absolutely. It is the metric the federal government uses to determine if a school is effectively accommodating the athletic interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex.
And just to clarify, in this historical context, the underrepresented sex is exclusively women, right?
Yes, exclusively women in this context.
Okay, so let's break down these 3 independent ways to pass the test, because the mechanics here are super crucial for you to understand everything else we're going to talk about. So prong 1 is proportionality.
Right, the big one.
Yeah. This means that women's athletic participation must be substantially proportional to women's share of the undergraduate enrollment.
So it's basically a math equation.
Exactly. So if State University's student body is 60% female, then roughly 60% of the varsity athletes actually taking the field should be female.
Right. It is a straightforward objective calculation. You pull the enrollment numbers from the registrar, you pull the roster numbers from the athletic department, and you see if the percentages align.
It seems simple enough on paper, but then prong, 2 steps away from the math entirely. Prong 2 looks at history and continuing practice.
And this is where it gets tricky.
Right, because this requires a school to show a demonstrated ongoing record of expanding athletic opportunities for the underrepresented sex.
That is where things get significantly more complex for the auditors. You essentially have to prove a trajectory.
Wait, but how do you mathematically prove a history and continuing practice? Because that sounds incredibly subjective compared to just, looking at an enrollment spreadsheet.
Oh, it is. It's highly subjective.
Like if I add one women's bowling team in a decade, does that count as a history of expansion? I mean, who decides that?
Well, that exact ambiguity caused immense friction. The Office for Civil Rights evaluates this by looking at a timeline. They ask questions like, did you add a sport 3 years ago? Did you elevate a club sport to varsity status last year? Are you actively responding to the growing athletic interests of women on your campus? Or, has your women's program just been stagnant for 15 years?
So it requires a real qualitative judgment about the institution's momentum.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. If a school cuts a women's team, they immediately fail prong 2. Because cutting a team is the literal antithesis of expanding opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's unpack prong 3. Full and effective accommodation.
Right.
This means the existing athletic program fully meets the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex. Basically, if there are female students on campus with the interest, the ability, and the competitive competition available in a specific region to play a varsity sport, the school has to provide that opportunity.
And this prong puts the burden of proof in a completely different place.
How so?
Well, a school relying on prong 3 essentially has to say, yes, our numbers might be disproportionate, and maybe we haven't added a new team in 5 years. But we have surveyed our entire student body, and we are currently funding every single viable women's sport that our female students actually want to play.
Ah, okay. So it's like saying we would offer more, but nobody wants to play anything else.
Exactly.
And the most critical detail here, which the Office for Civil Rights actually had to officially clarify later on in 1996, because there was so much ongoing confusion, is that a school only needs to pass one of these prongs.
Right, just one, not all 3.
That completely shifts the compliance strategy, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a menu of options, not a cumulative exam.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy for you. It's like fulfilling a college graduation requirement for a science credit. You don't have to take biology, chemistry, and physics. Passing just biology gets you the credit. You choose the path that works for your schedule.
That's a great way to think about it.
So given that flexibility, why does the public discourse, and frankly, why do so many university administrators act like proportionality, the first prong, is the absolute only option they have?
What's fascinating here is that the regulators designed proportionality to be a safe harbor.
A safe harbor. What does that mean in this context?
The idea was to offer an objective mathematical standard, so a school could definitively say, look, our numbers match our enrollment. Do not investigate us. We are compliant.
Okay, so it's bulletproof.
Right. It was never intended to be an inflexible quota. But, bureaucratic systems inevitably breed optimization. Proportionality became the focal point because math is defensible in court.
Because if you get sued, it's easier to point to a spreadsheet.
Exactly. The other 2 prongs require defending qualitative judgments about what constitutes history or what constitutes interest. And opposing lawyers can easily pick those apart. Math is just harder to debate.
So proportionality basically became the path of least resistance for compliance officers.
Yes. Which naturally turned it into the biggest target for critics who viewed it as a rigid quota system.
So we have this government blueprint in 1979. But, a piece of paper in Washington doesn't buy basketballs or secure practice times.
It definitely doesn't.
So who was actually tasked with turning this legal mandate into a physical reality, especially when the universities were actively refusing to open their checkbooks.
That falls entirely on the shoulders of the first generation of women's athletic directors.
Right.
They were handed the blueprint, but they had to scrounge for the actual building materials. And the paramount example in the source material we have is Dr. Christine Grant.
Dr. Grant's story is just incredible. It perfectly illustrates the pure logistical nightmare of the era. She was a Scottish emigre, and in 1973, while she was actually still finishing her doctorate, she became the University of Iowa's very first women's athletic director.
And the conditions she inherited there were frankly draconian.
Yeah.
We are not talking about a lack of luxury here. We're talking about a lack of basic operational infrastructure.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to dig into the actual mechanics of what she accomplished. It highlights the absurdity of the resistance she faced. Dr. Grant elevated 11 different women's sports to varsity status by the 1974-1975 academic year. 11 entire programs.
It's a massive undertaking.
And her budget for that initial foundational year was roughly $3,000.
Let's really contextualize that for a second. $3,000 to run a massive multi-sport collegiate operation.
Right. I mean, imagine trying to fund travel, uniforms, and equipment for 11 entire teams with the equivalent of a used car budget. Think about the physical requirements here.
It's staggering.
You have to transport dozens of human beings to different states for competition. You need specialized equipment, field hockey sticks, gymnastics mats, tennis nets.
All of which is expensive.
Very. You need custom uniforms so your team doesn't look like a random physical education class. You have to pay officials and referees for every single game. I mean, doing all of that on $3,000 is practically an exercise in financial alchemy. How did they even make this work?
Well, it required an entirely different operational model. It meant the coaches were driving the team vans themselves, often straight through the night to save on hotel costs.
Oh, wow.
It meant administrators were literally washing the team uniforms in their own home bathtubs because they couldn't afford a laundry service.
That is real dedication.
It really was. It meant relying heavily on volunteer labor and just calling in favors to secure a few hours of practice time in the main gymnasium. And usually, that practice time was at 6 in the morning or 10 at night, well after the men's teams were finished.
But the amazing thing is, she did more than just scrape by. She built a nationally admired program out of absolutely nothing.
She was a powerhouse.
She became an expert witness in major Title IX lawsuits. She testified repeatedly before Congress defending the law. And decades later, in 2007, she even received the NCAA's Gerald R. Ford Award for Lifetime Advocacy.
Which is pretty ironic given her history.
Right, because the fascinating part of her legacy is her deep connection to the original governing body of women's sports, which, as you alluded to, was not the NCAA.
No, it wasn't. And this is a crucial piece of lost sports history. The governing body was the AIAW, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women.
The AIAW.
Right. They governed women's college sports from 1971 to 1982. And Dr. Grant was actually elected its president in 1979, which happens to be the exact same year the three-part test was finalized.
And at its peak, the AIAW wasn't some fringe group. It was a massive ecosystem, encompassing roughly 960 member schools.
It was huge.
But they didn't just mirror the NCAA's structure, did they? They operated on a fundamentally different philosophical premise.
Yes, completely different. The AIAW was explicitly education-centered and athlete-controlled. It was an organization designed by women specifically for female athletes, and it deliberately contrasted itself with what the NCAA had become.
So how exactly did that philosophical difference manifest in their day-to-day rules?
Yeah.
If I'm an athlete in the AIAW back then, how is my life different from a male athlete in the NCAA?
It impacted everything, honestly, from recruiting all the way to financial aid. The NCAA at that time was already heavily entrenched in this commercial, revenue-driven model.
Especially for men's football and basketball.
Exactly. The focus was television rights, massive stadiums, and essentially treating these athletes as quasi-professional entertainment assets.
Right.
The AIAW actively resisted that commercialization. They actually initially opposed offering athletic scholarships at all.
Wait, really? No scholarships?
None. They feared it would lead to bidding wars and basically corrupt the educational mission of the universities.
Wow.
Now, even when they eventually did allow scholarships, mostly due to competitive pressure, Their rules were carefully designed to protect the students' academic life from being swallowed entirely by the business of sports.
So it was really about being a student first.
Exactly. They restricted aggressive recruiting tactics. It was a holistic educational approach, fiercely guarding the student half of the term student-athlete.
It sounds like a pure, almost utopian vision for college sports. You have nearly 1,000 schools operating under this education-first mandate, governed by women. But what happens when a massive corporate entity realizes your utopian ecosystem is actually highly valuable?
Well, you get one of the most consequential and frankly ruthless corporate takeovers in the history of American sports.
Yeah. And the relationship between the NCAA and women's sports is just steeped in bitter irony. Because according to our sources, throughout the 1970s, the NCAA actively deployed its lobbying power in Washington to fight against Title IX.
Oh, they fought it tooth and nail.
Hmm.
They viewed the mandate as an existential financial threat.
That's so.
The NCAA argued that forcing universities to fund women's sports would drain critical resources away from their revenue-generating men's programs. They actually lobbied hard to have revenue-producing sports like football entirely exempted from the law.
They just wanted football carved out completely.
Exactly. But they lost that lobbying battle. Title IX survived, and women's sports became a mandatory, permanent fixture on these college campuses.
And the moment that legal reality set in, the NCAA executed a complete strategic reversal, like a total flip-flop.
Yes, they did.
By the 1981-1982 academic year, they suddenly began offering their own competing women's championships.
It was a cold, calculated market realization. If women's sports had to exist by federal law, and if they were going to grow and potentially generate real revenue or command television audiences, the NCAA decided they needed to own that market.
Right, they couldn't stand a rival.
Exactly. They could not allow a rival governing body with a massive footprint like the AIAW to thrive independently.
So let's look at the actual mechanics of this takeover. How does one governing body just swallow another?
With money.
Yeah. The NCAA leveraged its vast, accumulated capital from decades of men's sports. They approached these schools in the AIAW and basically offered incentives that the AIAW's education-first model simply could not match financially. For instance, the NCAA offered to pay all travel expenses for women's teams attending their championships.
And you have to remember the context we just talked about. For an athletic director staring at a stretched, tiny budget, a full travel subsidy is an irresistible proposition.
Oh, it's a no-brainer. But the absolute death blow was television. The NCAA used its existing leverage with networks to promise major television exposure for women's championships, but only if the schools jumped ship.
And the market forces reacted instantly to that.
They really did. NBC, which was the television network that had been working with the AIAW, suddenly declined to exercise its option to televise their championships.
And the evaporation of that television deal triggered a cascading collapse. Corporate sponsors follow television eyeballs.
Always.
So when NBC backed out, the sponsors fled the AIAW and migrated all their money over to the NCAA's new women's tournaments. The AIAW was essentially starved of its operating capital almost overnight.
It's brutal. So they ran their final championship in June of 1982, but they didn't just dissolve quietly, right? The AIAW filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against the NCAA, alleging monopolization under the Sherman Act.
It was a desperate legal Hail Mary to save the organization.
So break down the logic of that antitrust claim for us. How exactly did the AIAW argue the NCAA's actions were illegal, rather than just, aggressive business tactics?
Well, under the Sherman Act, the AIAW argued that the NCAA was using its undeniable monopoly power in men's college sports to unlawfully capture this completely separate market for women's sports.
Okay.
They alleged predatory pricing. Basically, they said the NCAA was offering women's championships at a massive financial loss, subsidized by their men's revenues, specifically to drive the AIAW out of business.
Oh, I see.
They also argued the NCAA illegally tied its men's television contracts to a requirement that the networks also had to cover their new women's events, which squeezed the AIAW right out of the broadcast market.
It's a really compelling argument. But the courts didn't buy it.
No, they didn't.
The AIAW lost in district court in 1983, and then the appellate court affirmed the dismissal in 1984.
The courts ultimately ruled that the NCAA had not illegally acquired a monopoly. The legal interpretation was that the NCAA simply offered a superior product in the form of better financial subsidies and broader TV exposure, and that the schools freely chose to migrate to the better deal.
So it's just capitalism.
Basically, in antitrust law, outcompeting a rival by offering greater resources is not inherently illegal, even if it results in a monopoly.
So this transition fundamentally altered the daily experience for female college athletes. On the positive side, they suddenly had access to the NCAA's massive vault of resources. They got the travel subsidies, the upgraded facilities, the television prestige.
Right, the tangible benefits were real.
But the cost of that upgrade was the complete loss of the athlete-controlled education-first governance model. They were absorbed into the exact commercial machine the AIAW had warned them about.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it presents a fascinating historical paradox. Did Title IX kill the AIAW?
That's a great question.
Because the law created the mandate that made women's sports too valuable for the NCAA to ignore, which inadvertently painted a massive target right on the AIAW's back.
It's a tragic irony, but while the AIAW and NCAA were battling over sports governance, the actual enforcement of Title IX was facing a completely different existential legal threat.
Yes.
And this threat didn't come from a multi-billion-dollar sports monopoly. It came from a tiny private college in Pennsylvania with a truly brilliant legal strategy.
This brings us to the story of Grove City College and the landmark 1984 Supreme Court case, Grove City College v. Bell. It is an absolute masterclass in exploiting the specific wording of federal statutes.
To really understand the stakes here, I think we have to state the strongest possible case for the holdouts objectively. Because regardless of where you stand on federal overreach, you have to admit Grove City had a logically sound legal argument.
It absolutely did.
Their argument was not framed as a crusade against equal rights. It was framed as a fundamental defense against federal overreach, based on a remarkably strict reading of how money flows.
Right. Grove City College was a private institution that deliberately structured its entire financial architecture to avoid federal entanglements. They refused direct federal research grants. They refused direct institutional aid.
They wanted to be completely off the grid.
Exactly. They wanted to operate entirely independent of Washington's regulatory strings.
Okay, so if they take zero direct federal dollars, how did the federal government claim jurisdiction over them in the first place?
The government argued jurisdiction based on the students. Grove City admitted students who paid their tuition using federal basic educational opportunity grants, which we now know as Pell Grants.
Okay, let's trace the actual plumbing of that money. A student applies for a Pell Grant. The federal government approves it. Does the government mail a check directly to the college?
Well, administratively, the funds often pass through the university's financial aid office to be applied to the student's account. But legally and philosophically, Grove City argued the money belonged to the student.
I see.
The federal government was assisting the student, not the institution. Therefore, Grove City College categorically refused to sign the Title IX compliance assurance document that was demanded by the Office for Civil Rights.
Because their logic was, if I don't take your money, I don't follow your rules.
Exactly. They argued that a law governing programs receiving federal financial assistance simply did not apply to them.
The United States Supreme Court evaluated that exact logic in 1984, and their ruling caused absolute chaos.
It was an earthquake.
The court delivered a highly specific surgical decision. First, they ruled that student grants did constitute federal financial assistance to the college. So Grove City was not entirely exempt from Title IX.
But here comes the pivot that changed everything.
Right.
The court focused intensely on the phrase program or activity in the statute. They ruled that Title IX's coverage only applied to the specific isolated department that directly received and administered those federal funds.
Meaning the financial aid office.
Precisely. The financial aid office had to comply with Title IX. They couldn't discriminate in how they processed the grants.
Sure.
But the English department, the chemistry labs, and most critically for our deep dive, the athletic department, they were entirely exempt from federal civil rights enforcement under Title IX.
Because athletic departments don't process Pell Grants. They are funded by ticket sales, alumni donations, and university general funds.
Exactly. This program-specific ruling absolutely gutted athletic enforcement nationwide. Overnight, collegiate athletic departments across the entire country fell completely outside the legal reach of Title IX.
What does that actually look like on the ground? Like if I'm an investigator for the Office for Civil Rights in 1984, what happens to my caseload the day this ruling comes down?
You have to drop everything.
Just walk away.
Just walk away. The real-world consequence was immediate and devastating to all the progress made since the 1979 guidelines. The federal enforcement body was legally forced to drop, suspend, or severely narrow dozens of active investigations into athletic inequality. They simply no longer had the jurisdiction to enforce the rules they had spent 7 years writing.
This created a period historians refer to as the 4-year gap. For 4 years, female athletes suddenly found themselves with virtually no federal protection regarding equal athletic opportunity. The Supreme Court essentially carved a massive loophole right into the statute.
But in the American system, when the court interprets a law in a way that goes against what the legislature actually intended, Congress has the power to rewrite the dictionary and sew the loophole shut.
Which sets the stage for one of the most dramatic, high-stakes legislative battles of the 1980s. Congress drafted the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1987.
And the sole purpose of this legislation was to explicitly redefine that troublesome phrase, program or activity.
Right. The new act stated unequivocally that if any part of an institution receives federal funds, even just the financial aid office, the entire institution, including the athletic department, is subject to Title IX's and parallel civil rights laws.
It was a direct, targeted legislative override of the Supreme Court's Grove City decision. Congress was asserting its original intent.
But the path to passing it was a complete political minefield because it faced fierce opposition from the executive branch. On March 16, 1988, President Ronald Reagan vetoed the Civil Rights Restoration Act.
And to understand the political gravity of that moment, we really have to look at Reagan's argument.
Yeah.
He was a highly popular sitting president. His veto wasn't framed as opposition to civil rights, but as a defense against federal overreach.
That same argument again.
Right. He argued that the act represented an unwarranted, vast expansion of federal regulatory power into the private affairs of independent colleges and state institutions. He genuinely believed it would subject every facet of an institution to federal micromanagement just because one department accepted federal aid.
So what does this all mean? It means for 4 years, schools could essentially ignore Title IX in sports until Congress explicitly rewrote the dictionary definition. But a veto by a president of Reagan's stature is usually an absolute death knell for legislation.
Usually, yes.
Overriding it requires a 2/3 supermajority in both the House and the Senate. In a polarized political environment, getting 2/3 of politicians to agree on what day it is, let alone a complex civil rights mandate, is nearly impossible.
But the coalition supporting the restoration of these protections was massive and highly organized. The public pressure was intense.
It must have been. Because within days, Congress marshaled staggering bipartisan majorities to override the president. On March 20th, in 1988, the Senate voted to override the veto by a margin of 73 to 24, and the House of Representatives followed suit with a vote of 292 to 133.
The rarity of a bipartisan veto override against a popular sitting president on a major civil rights issue, it just cannot be overstated.
It's historic.
It really signaled a profound national consensus that the Grove City loophole was an unacceptable departure from the law's intent. The federal enforcement power was officially restored.
So Congress forces compliance back onto the table. You would assume the battle over the rules was finally settled. The loophole is closed, the federal regulators have their teeth back.
You would assume that, but if powerful institutions cannot avoid the law entirely, they will try to test its very boundaries in court.
They'll try to break the blueprint itself.
Exactly. Which brings us into the 1990s and the most significant legal test of those 1979 guidelines. We have to examine the landmark case, Cohen v. Brown University, decided in 1996.
The factual setup here is striking. Brown University, an elite Ivy League institution, makes a calculated decision to demote its women's gymnastics and volleyball teams from full varsity status down to club status.
And we really need to clarify what a demotion to club status physically entails for an athlete. It is not just a change in title on a university brochure.
Right, break that down for us. If I am a varsity gymnast at Brown and my team becomes a club sport, what actually changes in my day-to-day life?
Everything changes. You lose your university-funded full-time coaching staff, you lose priority access to the athletic trainers, the medical staff, and the physical therapy equipment.
Which is huge for safety.
Massive. You lose your operational budget for travel and equipment. You are suddenly responsible for organizing your own practices and securing your own funding.
Basically bait sales to go to meets.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And crucially, At a highly selective school like Brown, you lose the admission support that helps recruit top-tier athletes in the first place.
Oh, because the university is no longer holding admission spots for your incoming recruits.
Exactly. Demoting a team to club status is effectively gutting the program's ability to compete at an elite level.
Now, when in response to this demotion, the athletes, led by a gymnast named Amy Cohen, sued the university. They argued that by stripping these teams of their varsity standing and resources, Brown was violating Title IX by failing to provide equal athletic opportunities.
And this case became the ultimate crucible for the 1979 three-part test. Brown University's legal defense didn't just argue they were compliant. They essentially challenged the validity and application of the entire test.
They went after the rules themselves.
Right, specifically attacking the proportionality prong as an illegal quota system.
So how did the federal courts evaluate Brown's athletic program against the three-part test?
The First Circuit Court of Appeals thoroughly dismantled Brown's defense and decisively upheld the 1979 policy interpretation. They ran Brown through the gauntlet of the three prongs and found the university failed all of them.
Okay, let's walk through that failure step by step. Prong 1, proportionality.
Brown failed prong 1 because their percentage of athletic opportunities for women was significantly lower than their percentage of female undergraduate enrollment. The math simply did not align.
Makes sense. Prong 2, history and continuing practice of expansion.
Brown failed prong 2 spectacularly.
Because they cut teams.
Exactly. The court noted that demoting viable women's teams to club status is the exact opposite of showing a history of expanding opportunities. You cannot claim momentum while simultaneously cutting programs.
And prong 3, full and effective accommodation.
Brown failed prong 3 because they had actively demonstrated that there were women on campus with the interest, the ability, and the competitive drive to play varsity gymnastics and volleyball.
Right, these were existing teams.
Exactly. These were existing, viable teams with willing athletes. By demoting them, Brown was clearly not fully accommodating the existing interests of women on campus.
The Cohen v. Brown decision is paramount because it cemented the three-part test into modern legal precedent. It affirmed that HCW's original 1979 interpretation was the valid, enforceable standard for the nation. And crucially, the court officially framed the proportionality prong not as an illegal quota, but as a permissible safe harbor.
Right. It was a legal target universities could aim for, but it wasn't a rigid requirement if they could pass the other prongs. But, this raises an important question.
What's that?
If a prestigious, incredibly well-resourced Ivy League university like Brown couldn't defeat the three-part test in federal court, despite throwing immense legal resources at it, how do schools actively resist compliance today? Because we know statistical disparities and resource inequities still exist across the country. If they cannot beat the law in the courtroom, what is their strategy?
That is the perfect question, and it brings us to the most modern and, frankly, the most bizarre section of our deep dive. If athletic directors can't beat the law in federal court, they try to beat it on paper. Welcome to the era of roster management. I like to call it spreadsheet gymnastics.
It's a very fitting term. This is where we examine the incredibly creative, often deceptive counting methods used by what the dossier calls the modern laggards.
The laggards.
Right. These are institutions that desperately want the appearance of legal compliance without actually investing the necessary resources to achieve true equality on the field.
The investigative reporting detailed in our sources regarding these methods is staggering. It sounds like corporate accounting fraud, but applied to college athletes. So let's detail these counting methods, starting with the concept of male practice players.
Yes, male practice players.
Federal reporting rules technically allow schools to count men who practice regularly with women's teams as female participants for the sake of their official Title IX compliance numbers.
Now, to be fair, the origin of this rule is actually based on a specific competitive reality. Elite women's basketball teams, for example, frequently use male practice squads to simulate the speed, size, and physicality of their toughest female opponents.
Right. It helps them prepare for the highest levels of competition.
Exactly.
I understand the competitive logic there. But schools have entirely weaponized this loophole to pad their gender equity numbers. The sources cite one analysis that found an absolutely shocking statistic. At least 1 in 4 reported women's basketball players at certain institutions were actually men.
It's incredible.
Let me just stop and emphasize that. Wait, a school can literally count a man as a woman to prove they are offering equal sports opportunities to women. That is wild. That completely subverts the entire philosophical purpose of the statute.
It is an auditing nightmare. By counting a male practice player as a female participant, the university artificially inflates its female participation numbers, moving them closer to that proportionality safe harbor. And they do this without actually having to give a scholarship, a locker, a uniform, or a roster spot to an actual female athlete. It is a paper illusion.
And the illusion gets even more complex when you look at how universities count the female athletes they actually do have. Let's talk about the phenomenon of triple counting.
Oh, triple counting is incredibly pervasive, particularly in track and field programs. A university will offer cross-country in the fall season, indoor track in the winter season, and outdoor track in the spring season. Under federal reporting guidelines, these are legally considered three distinct, separate teams.
So, a school will take one single female distance runner who runs cross-country in the fall, stays on the team for indoor track, and competes again in outdoor track. And they count her as three separate athletic opportunities for women on their Title IX compliance report.
They are essentially duplicating the exact same human being on a spreadsheet. They make it look like they are providing opportunities and funding to three different women, expanding their overall female participation numbers drastically, when in physical reality, it is just one single athlete running year-round.
It's highly efficient accounting, but it masks the true number of individual women receiving athletic opportunities.
It really does.
But, I mean, even triple counting pales in comparison to the absolute pinnacle of roster padding, the phantom rowers.
The phantom rowers. This is where it gets truly egregious.
The sources detail how universities pad their women's rowing rosters with athletes who never actually compete and sometimes never even touch the water.
Women's rowing is particularly vulnerable to this specific manipulation because the sport inherently requires massive rosters. An 8-person shell needs 8 rowers, a coxswain, and several backups. To run a full program, you need dozens of athletes.
So how do schools exploit that structural need for large numbers?
They exploit it during the novice tryout phase. At the beginning of the academic year, a university might hold open tryouts for the novice women's rowing team. They will encourage any female student, regardless of athletic background, to just show up.
Okay.
They will then keep every single woman who attended a meeting or trial practice on the official reported roster just long enough to pass the federal compliance counting deadline.
And that deadline is usually tied to the date of the first official competition.
Exactly.
So once that census date passes, and the numbers are locked into the Federal Equity and Athletics Data Analysis Report, what happens to those novice rowers?
They are quietly let go, or they naturally drop off because they were never actually integrated into the team in the first place. Federal investigations and investigative journalists have found hundreds of these phantom roster spots across the country.
Hundreds of them.
We are talking about 50 women listed on a university's official crew roster who have never been in a boat, who do not own oars, who have never attended a 6 a.m. water practice, and who never traveled to a regatta.
But on the official federal report submitted to Washington, those 50 phantom rowers count exactly the same toward the school's gender equity proportionality as the starting point guard on the women's basketball team who plays 40 minutes a night.
Yes, exactly the same.
It is pure spreadsheet manipulation. And these aren't just historical anomalies from the 1990s. This is actively driving current litigation today.
Right. The sources highlight several ongoing legal battles. In 2021, the Fresno State women's lacrosse team won class certification in a lawsuit after their program was cut.
Wow, recently.
Very recently. And the core of their argument is that the university's compliance numbers were fundamentally manipulated through these exact roster management tactics, which masked true disparities. We also see San Diego State athletes suing over unequal financial aid, arguing that the school's claims of proportionality are based on rigged, artificially inflated participation numbers.
The bizarre part is how this deception is actually uncovered, because it doesn't usually come from an army of federal auditors dropping out of the sky to inspect boathouses, right?
No, the federal government simply does not have the manpower to audit every roster in the country. The enforcement mechanism relies heavily on the student-athletes themselves acting as whistleblowers and forensic accountants.
Which is an immense burden to place on a 19-year-old college student. I mean, think about it. It requires a female athlete to proactively look at her own university's official head count on a government website and ask the hard questions.
Right. She has to dig into the data.
She has to look at the data and say, wait, why are there 5 guys listed on our official women's volleyball roster?
Yeah.
Or a dedicated rower asking, Why does our federal report claim we have 80 athletes when I only ever see 30 girls sweating at practice every morning?
Exactly.
The athletes have to identify the abuse, gather the evidence, and report it themselves, often risking their own standing within the athletic department to do so.
Let's take that a step further, though, and look at the underlying psychology of this entire era of roster management. Because the bittersweet truth of this is, even the laggards now feel compelled to at least appear compliant. Yes, it is deceptive, and yes, it clearly violates the spirit of the law. But the fact that massive, powerful institutions go to such extraordinary, convoluted lengths to invent phantom players and triple-count runners, it tells us something profoundly important about the cultural shift.
They are terrified of failing the test on paper.
Precisely. The cultural and legal norm has shifted so significantly since 1972 that universities would rather risk a high-profile federal audit, face embarrassing lawsuits, and literally invent invisible athletes than stand up in public and admit they are defying the law and refusing to provide equal opportunities.
That's a great point.
The days of a Grove City college openly refusing to sign the compliance paper out of principle are completely over. Now, the battleground is entirely hidden within the margins of the spreadsheet because the public expectation of equality is absolute.
Which provides a perfect lens to recap this incredible journey. I mean, we started with the text of a law that didn't even mention sports, leading to a 7-year information vacuum. We saw the sheer resourcefulness of early builders like Dr. Christine Grant performing financial alchemy to stretch $3,000 across 11 sports.
We examine the rise of the AIAW, a unique governance model built specifically by and for women, and watch its tragic collapse as it was systematically absorbed by the massive commercial machinery of the NCAA.
And we analyzed the brilliant surgical legal brinkmanship of Grove City College, an argument so structurally precise it managed to gut federal civil rights enforcement for 4 entire years until Congress staged a historic bipartisan veto override against a popular president to sew the loophole shut.
And we traced how the 1979 three-part test survived aggressive challenges from Ivy League holdouts like Brown University, only to face a new, insidious era of resistance through the modern spreadsheet gymnastics of phantom rowers and male practice players.
So the ultimate takeaway for you listening to this is context. Whenever you see a headline about a college sports program being cut, or you read about a new class action lawsuit over athletic rosters and unequal financial aid, you now have the deep plumbing.
You know what they're fighting over.
You know the exact 1979 playbook they are using. You understand the profound difference between the physical reality of the locker room and the mathematical fiction of the federal compliance report.
You are equipped to look past the top-line numbers an athletic director might tout in a press conference and ask the deeper structural questions about how those numbers are actually being engineered.
Absolutely. Before we sign off, though, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to ponder. It's a paradox that stems directly from the history we've discussed today based on our sources. We rightly celebrate Title IX for forcing open doors that had been nailed shut and creating the massive, expansive landscape of women's sports that we enjoy today.
Of course.
But consider this paradox. Did the very federal law that empowered women's athletics inevitably destroy the only major sports organization, the AIAW, that was actually built, governed, and completely run by women?
It is a really complex paradox of progress.
It is. The pursuit of equality required surrendering control and merging into a commercial system designed entirely by and for men. It's something for you to mull over as you watch the next championship game.
It really asks a profound historical question about the true cost of integration, what was gained in resources and what was permanently lost in autonomy in the endless pursuit of compliance.
Well said. We want to enthusiastically thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Your curiosity makes this all possible. Keep questioning the spreadsheets and keep looking for the real stories hidden behind the numbers.